You're listening to The Blind Stealing the Blinds, a podcast by students of the game for students of the game. Join Dell and BJ in conversations about poker theory and bridging the gap between theory and application. We're all in this together. This week's topic, the pros and cons of straddling.
Hey, Dell, how's it going this week?
It's going well. It's going well. We just had this wonderful conversation this week with Lupe Soto and Tara Smith from the Women's Poker Association. And by the time this one comes out, everybody will have had a chance to listen to that podcast. And that's got me really stoked. And we're getting some good reviews. And everything's just going really good with our podcast. And everything's going really good with my poker and my life in general. I'm really blessed this week. I'm really blessed all the time. But this week, I'm at least capable of seeing it. How are you doing?
Well, that's good. That's good. It's always good to be able to recognize it. It's one thing for it to happen. It's another thing for you to be able to see it and appreciate it. Friday was April Fool's Day as of this recording. And apparently the poker gods had a huge April Fool's Day joke in store for me. I took the day off and I played poker for over 8 hours. In the middle, I took a lunch break, ate some sushi. It's my favorite food. Amazing. And I lost 2 buy-ins at 1-3. That might not seem like a big deal. Okay, I lost $800. So what? I played A-plus poker. I played the best poker I knew how. At no point was I in doubt of my ability to make sound decisions at the table. I went all in and lost to a 2-outer, a 6-outer, an 8-outer. I was finally at my last $140 and I shoved with queens, which is what, the third best hand in poker? I ran myself into a cold 4-bet with kings and lost. It was comical. I could not even be mad. I was amused at how badly I got smacked with the wrong side of the deck. And here's what my takeaway was. If the main reason that I lose a buy-in or two is because fate has to smack me repeatedly upside the head, that's not a bad place to be, because you know darn well when the upswing comes, and it will come, I will win way more than I lost in Friday's session. If anything, it was the best reminder that life and poker is just one big game. Like, poker is just one big session punctuated by periods of not playing poker. And I got to be happy about that.
Yeah, it's really a big change in what your mindset was, say, about a month and a half ago, when you were facing the same thing. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the fact that you've been able to put some more volume in. Yeah, it's great to hear this turnaround and awesome. Also, you brought up April Fools, which is great because we're talking about straddling. And for the most part, that's a foolhardy tactic to use at the table.
Not going to lie, I have some pretty strong opinions on straddling. Okay, we're going to cover 2 types of straddling in this episode, both under the gun and on the button. They each have some pros and cons. I would argue the cons far outweigh the pros. And in short, in my opinion, straddling is almost always a negative EV proposition you should avoid, except in certain situations, which we're going to discuss later. Talk about the problem, the solutions, the tools, and I really think the problem here is that players don't know why they straddle. They don't understand how straddles affect the game dynamics, and they don't know how to make money when employing the tactic. And we've talked before about understanding the incentives of why you bet. It's not just why you bet. The more and more we ask the question why in something, the increasingly frustrated I am with the actual question of why. I think why is too vague. Like, what is your incentive? What are you planning to achieve? What do you want the outcomes to be? Those are far more specific questions than just asking why. And when people straddle, they're not able to answer any of those questions.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that most players who straddle do know why they straddle. I think they know that for the most part, they're straddling from one of 3 reasons. I'm sure there's more, but these are the ones that come to mind to me. They're straddling because they like to gamble. That's a large portion. And that portion isn't listening to us today anyways. They don't really care how it changes the dynamic. To them, they just want bigger pots in their gambling. And that's great. That's great for us because we're going to make our decisions based on sound poker logic as opposed to, hey, I just feel like gambling. Another reason they do this, though, is to loosen up the game. When you sit down at a table that is really tight, there's a couple things that go on. First of all, the game can get boring when it's really, really tight. When the entire table dynamic is tight players, sometimes straddling can help loosen that up. The other reason can be because they think they have a skill advantage and they want the game to play bigger. But the thing is, if you're the only one straddling at the table, then you're making a negative EV play. No matter how big you think your skill advantage is, you can't overcome it. No matter how big you think your skill advantage is, you are now making a 2 big blind bet blind, and there is no way that your skill edge can overcome that over time. You just can't. You're not that good. All these reasons for doing it, how do we go about it? And is it really going to be a plus EV for us? So back to those questions. What's the incentive of doing it? Well, those are some of the incentives, but how do we do it profitably? And we can't unless we have deep enough stacks. Stack depth is going to be the biggest thing. And most people aren't thinking about stack depth. And this is like literally one of the most important things within the game of poker to always be aware of. What's the stack depth and how does my action affect that stack depth? So if you're playing 100 big blinds deep and you straddle, you just changed the game from 100 big blinds effective to 50 big blinds effective.
Yeah, that really brings us to con number 1. We have the effective stack size. Now, I do want to make a point. We said that we're going to talk about 2 types of straddles here, and these cons and pros apply to both. The only real differences between the under the gun straddle and the button straddle is that if you can straddle on the button, that gives you the best position both pre and post flop, but these same cons apply. Once the pre-flop tactic has been employed, you've done straddle. You're either in position or out of position. For the remainder of the hand, these cons will still apply. You're going to have the effective stack size by doubling the blind structure. Now you're playing a 50 big blind game instead of a 100 big blind game. So now you have the average rec playing a 1-3-6 game or 2-5-10 game that they're 1, probably not properly rolled for, and 2, they don't understand how the increased blind structure affects the game dynamics. And that's going to get into how they play post-flop. And straddling, unfortunately, almost necessarily leads to the second con, which is almost counterintuitive. Players tend to play wider in a straddle. And a lot of players, when they straddle, they're going to call the straddle, and they're going to keep calling. So you're going to get this cascade of calls because you have all this dead money in the middle. So why wouldn't they call? Instead of 1-3 being in the pot, now you have 1-3-6 being in the pot. Someone else calls. Another person calls. Next thing you know, you have like $21 in the pot. Of course you're going to go along for that ride. And players tend to play even wider. The weird thing about straddling, if you understand the fact that your effective stack size just got cut in half, you need to deviate. I think, Dell, you had mentioned you only really have one range, and you expand and contract that range based on factors. One of the factors that requires you to constrict your range is effective stack size. So you are going to stop playing suited connectors, suited gappers. You're probably going to play a more linear range, not pulled or merged, and your opponents are going to play wider. So here you are playing a tighter range, and they're all playing wider, and there is way more money in the pot. So now what? You got to hope that you smash the flop?
Yeah, I think we need to take a moment and explain exactly what you were trying to say there. I think that what people need to understand is when you are in a hand where somebody else is straddled, you are now going to, if you want to play it profitably, you now are going to want to play a tighter, more linear range. The reason for that is by straddling, they have just drastically reduced the SPR going forward. On every street now, it's going to be reduced to what it would have been without the straddle. So when we're dealing with smaller SPRs, we need stronger hands pre-flop, because what happens is you're going to find that the money's going in a lot more on the flop. This is great when you have top of range and your hands are strong. That's great. It's really not any good when you have a speculative hand that may have hit second or third pair, or you have a speculative hand that is hoping to get its draw on the turn of the river, all of a sudden these hands have lost their value. You're not going to have the same, we're going to take my favorite hand that always comes up, 7-6 suited. When somebody straddles and I'm now suddenly playing a game less than 100 big blinds, this has gone out of my range. And the reason being is, even if I 3-bet it, I go to post flop. The problem is now I don't have the maneuverability. There's going to be a smaller SPR. So it's going to be harder to push my opponents off a hand. Top pair is going to be more valuable, particularly when it's a strong kicker. Overpair is going to be a lot stronger than it would be with higher SPRs. So this is what we're trying to say here, is that we're trying to say that you need to tighten up in order to play in straddled pots profitably. And most players are doing literally just the opposite. So when you straddle, are you going to tighten up? Well, that depends on what happens before the action gets to you, because you're going to get to be the last person to act. And as the last person to act, it's going to get around to you. If it's just been limped around to you, well, you can play 100% of your range. But if it's been raised and 3-bet, well, you have to play tighter too. You have more money already invested in the pot, but you might find yourself that if you want to play profitably, you might find yourself throwing away an extra 2 big blinds that you never had to throw away.
Yeah, it's terrible when we have to throw money away for no good reason. It's worse when we force our opponents to play optimal poker. And this is really con number 3. We degrade our ability to capitalize on our opponent's mistakes when we essentially help our opponents avoid those mistakes in the first place to play more optimally. If we are structuring the effective stack sizes in such a way that we're going to get the money in, well, we can only get the money in if we're at top of range, or we have, strong pairs, maybe 2 pairs, whatever, maybe we smash the flop. That takes away our skill advantage in all of that post-flop playability, all those skills we have developed as thinking studied players, because once the SPR gets so low, you're almost in this shove or fold moment. And if we force our opponents to play optimal poker, well, we make our money when our opponents make mistakes. If we prevent our opponents from making those mistakes, we prevent ourselves from making money. So that's another huge con, in my opinion, of straddling. Now, to your point, if you're the only one straddling, it kind of sucks. Straddling is a lot like socialism jokes. It only works if everyone gets it. I'm glad this is an audio podcast and not a video podcast, because Dell just rolled his eyes so hard, I'm sure he saw his brain. When we can convince the entire table to straddle, that might be a place where we could actually effectively straddle. But the stars have to align. If you have a skill advantage, and if the stacks are deep enough, and if we can get everyone to do it, then we can be a little bit more patient. If the stacks are deep enough, our opponents might not know, but we know that we want to play tighter. We can be patient and wait for those top of range, top 10% of hands, and then we can open, we can re-raise, we can get stacks in, and we might be profitable that way. But again, the stars have to align. That's kind of hard to do.
Well, yes and no. So there is one thing that I'll say about straddling. I am far more likely to straddle than BJ is. And there's a lot of games now. I mean, used to be every game was 100 big blind buy-in. Now there's games that let you buy in for 200, 300 big blinds. There are games that you can buy in for 500 big blinds if you have a skill advantage. And when I say if you have a skill advantage, every poker player thinks they do. So you have to be very honest with yourself as to whether or not you have skill advantage and whether or not it's big enough to really make it worth straddling. But if you have that situation where you're very deep, then straddling doesn't hurt you with post-flop playability. You can still maneuver post-flop. You can still have a high SPR post-flop. You can still make large bets relative to the pot that can push a player off their hand. So if you're really deep and you have a skill advantage and you can talk everybody into the table, everybody wants to straddle, then by all means do it. I think you're going to magnify your advantages by doing that. The thing is that it can make the game more fun. It's not all negative. It can make the game more fun. It can loosen up some players. But in the end, if your goal is to make money, you need to make sure that everything that you need to make money is there. You don't want to be hampering yourself. You don't want to be making it easier on your opponents.
I like the concept you brought about making money, and I struggle with this. It's a little bit counterintuitive because I think being quote unquote good for the game might get you more EV in the long run than if I were to just have my headphones in, have my hoodie on, have my sunglasses on, don't talk to anyone, just be this antisocial crusher who is mathematically sound, playing GTO poker and exploiting as appropriate. I think we might be losing EV in the long run because people don't want to engage with us. The other time that I would consider straddling is to keep the game social. If everybody wants to straddle and somebody's like, hey, let's do a mandatory round of straddles, and everybody around the table is good with it, I'm not going to be the poker party pooper and say no. I'm going to go along with it. I might actually be the guy that initiates it. I might be the one that says, hey, let's do a round of straddles, in the hopes that everyone does it. If everyone doesn't want to do it, then I'm not going to do it. It's a negative EV play. But if it keeps the game social, if it keeps the game fun, if it keeps the spewy whales at my table because they're getting bored and they are looking for games elsewhere, no, stay here. Let's get some straddles on. Let's do that. That might be another time when I straddle. That's almost like some social engineering.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was just thinking, like, who always says no to the straddles? It's the net, right? It's always the net that says no to it. And the funny part is the straddle would automatically make the way they play the game more profitable, So therein lies the irony of it. And that goes more to the fact that people just don't understand what straddling does to the game dynamics. So, yeah, I think that keeping it social, I think we make more money when everybody at the table is having fun. That's my opinion. Some want to get under people's skin, and that's how they get them to make a mistake. But I think the overall EV is more when everybody's having fun and people don't mind losing their money to you. When they get stacked and they get up from the table and they think to themselves, well, at least I got stacked off by that guy. He's pretty cool.
Poker's a social game. We want more players to play. We want more players to have fun. If we stack players and they leave the game and never come back, that's not good. That's not fun. You got to be good for the game. I don't think being good for the game means being a total degen. I'm not against being a total degen. Let me say that if you want to be a total degen, have at it.
Especially if they're at the table with you, right?
Yeah, of course. I will live it up. I will gladly partake in the degenification of the table. It's going to be a lot of fun.
I think we've pretty much already discussed the solutions, but I want to hit them real quick so that maybe saying them twice will stick with people. For our solutions here, we want to remember that when you straddle, you effectively become the new big blind. You've literally just created a new big blind. And you are it. This means that stack sizes will be less relative big blinds. You may not be 100 big blinds deep anymore. You might be playing a 50 big blind game, and you have to make that adjustment. Understand how straddling affects stack size and also how it affects decisions for post-flop play. You're going to find yourself getting the money in a lot quicker, or you're going to find yourself having to check and fold a lot more, which is never a good place to be. Before straddling, I'd like to suggest to our listeners that they answer these questions. Are stacks deep enough to make straddling profitable? Are enough players willing to straddle to make it profitable? And do I have a skill advantage? And if so, will it be helped by straddling?
Yeah, those are excellent questions everyone should ask. It amazes me how infrequently people consider stack sizes as a regular part of their play. Whenever you play any hand, you should be considering stack sizes because that's going to inform so much of your range and your opponent's range. And when there's a straddle in play, that's going to inform it twice as hard. You really got to think about those things. And that's a reminder for me. I sometimes fall into the habit of not considering stack sizes. I think my skill edge is so high, it doesn't even matter. And that's just hubris, really. It's arrogant hubris. And I need to check myself on that. But to that end, for those solutions, I think we have some tools to offer. And really one is always bankroll management, know your limits. When someone has a straddle on and it makes the game play at twice as high as it's supposed to play, you're now playing a 1-3-6 game or a 2-5-10 game. Are you rolled to play 2-5-10 or 1-3-6? I'm not talking about shot taking. That's different. If you're not comfortable playing at those higher stakes, you need to find a different table. You can always table select. You can always table change. That's perfectly fine. And if you're going to play that table, or if you're going to find a different table, whenever straddles are on, you need to understand how to construct your ranges and deviate effectively based on those stack sizes, especially when they're cut in half. We've talked about it in previous episodes, where you need to come up with a well-constructed range using things like Flopzilla, or Poker Cruncher, or Equilab. There are all sorts of tools we've mentioned before to help you create a well-constructed range with incentives in mind, because your incentives will change when there's a straddle.
Yes, it will. I will say that this has been really good. I've enjoyed this. I don't really have anything more to say on this, BJ. Do you?
No, I don't. I think that's a wrap. Thanks as always for joining me, Dell. It's been a great time.
Yeah, it's been awesome. You want to roll us out of here?
Absolutely. And until next week, stick to the plan and may all your variants be positive.
This has been The Blind Stealing the Blinds, a podcast by students of the game for students of the game. If you haven't already done so, consider subscribing. And when you're not counting your chips, take a moment to leave the guys a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get yours.